Start the webinar. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex. I'm with the Scholar, and as always, I am live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at the bookstore. Thank you for tuning in this evening as we welcome Andrew Kaufman and Therese Ann Fowler to virtual Harrisburg. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers here this evening to you. Our moderator this evening is Therese Ann Fowler. Therese is the New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of Z, a novel of Zelda Fitzgerald, A Well-Behaved Woman, and most recently, A Good Neighborhood. She is married to author John Kessel. Our featured author this evening is Andrew Kaufman. Andrew is an associate professor in Slavic languages and literatures and assistant director of the Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Virginia. A PhD in Slavic languages and literatures from Stanford University, Kaufman is the author of Give War and Peace a Chance, Tolstoyan Wisdom for Troubled Times, and Understanding Tolstoy, and a co-author of Russian for Dummies. His work has been featured on Today, NPR, PBS, and in the Washington Post, and he has served as a Russian literature expert for Oprah's Book Club. Kaufman is the creator of Books Behind Bars, introducing incarcerated youth to the writings of Dostoyevsky and other authors. Of course, his new book that we're here for this evening is titled The Gambler Wife, a true story of love, risk, and the woman who saved Dostoyevsky. I've got to read just one quick blurb here from Jay Perini, who writes, quote, a true literary love story that defies and compels the imagination at once, end quote. Some quick housekeeping before we get started here. If you have a question for Andrew or Therese, please use the Q&A button towards the bottom of the screen. It's below our faces here. We'd love to hear from you, so ask away at any point, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible towards the end of the program. And if you're interested in purchasing a copy of The Gambler Wife, here it is once again, with a signed book plate from Andrew. We'd love for you to consider purchasing it through your host bookstore this evening, the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. That is a #1 way to support this event series and programming. So look in the chat room in just a moment, and I'll provide a link there for you, or simply head to midtownscholar.com. And once again, a reminder that we will be including a signed book plate with every order of your book. But now, without further ado, Andrew Kaufman and Therese Ann Fowler.
So first of all, I want to say thank you to Alex and Midtown Scholar Bookstore for hosting this event. Really appreciate it. Alex, one of the things that you said when we were chatting before is you're a big Dostoyevsky fan. And so one of my hopes is that by the end of this conversation, you will also be a big Anna fan, or at least fascinated by her. And I also want to thank Therese. This is a real, this is the way authors help one another, and an author of your stature willing to host this event and moderate this event is very much appreciated. And I've always been a fan of your novels and your fiction, so this is a great honor for me.
Okay, I'm blushing. Stop that. It's a pleasure to join you doing this. And I have to say, the greater, well, I don't know which was going to be the greater pleasure. We'll see by the end of the night. But reading this book was a terrific pleasure. I have written 2 different novels that are based on biography. And I have to tell you, I've read more than plenty of biographies about literary figures. It was just such a pleasure. I raced through the book. I was intrigued by everything I read, and I kept marking pages. I'll show you. I've got a bunch of different things in here where I was just like, oh my gosh, that's so much, the Fitzgeralds, or this reminds me very much of the Fitzgerald and Hemingway wives behind the great literary figures. So the other thing I want to say about that is just that Alex said he's a Dostoyevsky fan. Well, I haven't read any Dostoyevsky, but it didn't matter. Like, I could read this book without having any grounding in what Dostoyevsky wrote or anything actually about his biography, and still feel like I got everything that I needed to know about not just the author himself, but also about Russian history and the socioeconomics and the political culture of the time. I mean, you put it all together just so well that I'm in awe.
Thank you. That's a big compliment.
There we go. So now we've done the Mutual Admiration Society part of the evening. So I have some questions for you that I used some of the guides that we talked about earlier, but I'm probably going to go off script a little bit with some things because I was just so intrigued by so much of what I read. So one of the first things that I wanted to know is, as with so many literary wives, I'm going to put that in quotes, literary wives, including Zelda Fitzgerald, including all of Hemingway's wives, Anna I'm going to get her name right. Snitkin, is that correct? Anna Snitkin. She was largely unknown to anyone who isn't sort of in the depths of Russian literature, I'm sure. And you, as we heard in the introduction, you're a Tolstoy guy. So how did you get interested in this woman?
How did I get from Tolstoy to Anna Dostoyevskaya? Snitkina was her maiden name. So I was a Tolstoy guy. There's a poorly kept secret in Russian literary circles that claim that you're either a Tolstoy person or you're a Dostoevsky person, but you can't possibly like both. And for the longest time, I fit into that, category. I was a Tolstoy guy. I wrote a couple books about Tolstoy. But then as a result of my work of teaching Dostoevsky and other Russian writers in prison, I became very fascinated by Dostoevsky and really started to appreciate his genius in ways that I hadn't before, because he himself was incarcerated. A lot of the themes of crime and redemption really resonated with this population I worked with. So naturally, being a Russian literature scholar, I started reading up on Dostoevsky and reading biographies, and I kept coming across this name of this woman, Anna Dostoyevskaya, his second wife, who I could tell even from the biographies, in which she's often given a very small space, that she was important to Dostoevsky's career and his life. And then I started digging around in research about Anna, and there's not a lot about her, but there's quite a bit that by her, memoirs and unpublished letters, memoirs of others, a secret diary she kept in 1867, and just a plethora of sources. And it became clear to me that she was just not just important to Dostoevsky's life, she played a pivotal role. Without Anna Dostoyevskaya, we might very well have never had the brothers Karamazov, or the Possessed, also known as, or the Idiot, or the Adolescent.
Maybe not even the Gambler.
Well, almost certainly not the Gambler.
Yeah.
Because that is how they met. She came into his life when she was 20 years old and he was 44, and he had hired her as his young stenographer, fresh out of stenography school. This was her very first job, and she was incredibly proud that she had landed this job, and with none other than Fyodor Dostoevsky, who at that time was an important writer in Russia, but not yet one of its greatest. And she helped him meet an urgent publishing deadline on The Gambler, which if he had not met, he would have lost the copyrights to and the income from everything he wrote for the next 9 years. He had signed a horrible publishing agreement a few years prior. And so right from the very start, Anna saved Dostoevsky's career, quite literally.
Right. No, it's really astonishing. And I think what's especially impressive is that she was 20 years old when this occurred. And I'm just going to do a little footnote here. I'm looking at myself on the screen and I'm like, I'm all pink. It's that time of life for me, folks. It's having a hot flash during a literary event. So I'm rather pink, but I'm fine. So anyway, moving on. Anna was only 20 and she was not having hot flashes at the time that she was involved with Dostoevsky originally. But talk a little bit about this time in Russian history, and you use the word feminist a lot in the book and referring to Anna. What did feminism mean in the 1860s?
So this was a really tumultuous time in Russian history where there was fierce debates among two groups, the so-called conservatives, who believed that Russia's path to the future lay in a return to the past, and the liberals, on the other hand, and frankly, the radicals who believe just the opposite, that Russia needs to follow Western models of development. And the most radical of these radicals were revolutionaries. And so this was a period in Russian history which actually paved the way to the Russian Revolution of 1917. And at the same time, because of this ferment of ideas about modernization and progress, there were calls to provide women with more professional opportunities and educational opportunities. And so books and articles started appearing talking about what they called the woman question. And essentially, this was Russia's first feminist movement. The government started to open schools for high school age students for women, specifically for women, so they could have an education on a par with men. Anna happened to go to one of those schools. There were cooperatives that were founded by women at this time, some of the most radical of the feminists. And they didn't call themselves feminists, by the way. They called themselves, Anna very proudly considered herself an emancipated girl of the 60s. Why they use the word girl to describe a woman that's emancipated, it's another discussion, but that's what the feminists called themselves. And the most extreme among them were also very countercultural figures. They didn't just want to reform society or offer more opportunities for women. They wanted to basically get rid of society, and they started to support terrorism and the revolutionary movement. And they intentionally irked polite society by doing things that women were not supposed to do, like cutting their hair short or wearing, male-ish blue spectacles, or instead of wearing the frilly muslin dresses of the Russian myths, they would wear long, straight woolen dresses or even straight pants. They smoked in public. They did not believe in traditional marriage. And so this was the environment in which Anna Snitkina grew up, and this was the air she breathed. And so she was very influenced by a lot of these ideas. And when she came to work for Dostoyevsky, she was doing so in her mind as a young feminist, as someone who would not, who would not follow a man, who basically wanted her own profession and didn't want to rely on a man.
And she had, if I'm remembering right, she'd had the opportunity to marry even before this point, right? And she, unlike her older sister, had rejected the idea of the arranged marriage by her parents in favor of becoming, this emancipated woman or girl. So that, I can really, like, you paint a great picture of this young woman as she is coming to work. This is her first job opportunity, right? And the other part of this that I thought was interesting, and I think explains a lot about how the two of them pair up, or why they pair up, is that, in her household, she had been reading his fiction for, half a dozen years or more at this point, right? So she had this predisposition, an emotional attachment to him through his fiction. But do you think that explains entirely why she decided not to go that sort of full-on feminist course?
Well, let me just say a word about that, and if I forget the other part of the question about the Anna's growing up with Dostoevsky, because it's really interesting. And if I forget about the second half of your question, just say, Andy, you didn't even answer the second part of the question.
Sure. If I remember it.
But so it's so interesting, so many interesting things about this relationship. One of which is it actually began. Anna had met Dostoevsky on the page before she met him in person. And he was her father's favorite writer. Her dad was a big reader, and he subscribed to the journal that Dostoevsky and his brother had co-founded. And so he read everything that the Dostoevskys published. And so in the evenings after her father had fallen asleep on the wing chair, having read the latest edition of the Dostoevsky's journal, Anna would sneak up to him and take the magazine out of his hand and run off in the garden and lose herself in the pages of some of her favorite works of Dostoevsky's were Notes from the House of the Dead, which was Dostoevsky's semi-autobiographical prison memoir, or The Humiliated, Insulted, and Injured, which is a melodramatic novel about a struggling artist and an orphan girl. And so when she went to meet Dostoevsky, not only was this an incredible moment where, one of her literary idols was now, she was helping him publish a novel, but it also, she had fantasies about who this man was, and she realized very quickly that he was not that person that she had fantasized about. He was much more complex. He wasn't this noble, dashing figure, who
by far.
he was gruff, and he could be rude, and he smoked, and he kept forgetting her name because he had had an epileptic attack a couple of days before, she would later learn. So anyway, so it's just really fun to watch how these fantasies come crumbling down, when she meets the real person. And then I think I remember the second half of your question. So, but she stuck it out. She was even thinking on that first day that this is, I don't know, maybe I should follow the path of my older sister. Now I understand why women choose that path of traditional marriage. But she stuck it out, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the big picture reasons that Anna stuck it out early on, and they developed a deep, lasting bond and a business partnership, is because marriage to Dostoyevsky afforded her the opportunity not only to have a profession, where she was first his stenographer, later his business partner, his accountant. She participated in the creation of these works in various ways, and his publisher, and many other things. But it gave her the opportunity to have a profession that really meant something to her. She was a literary young woman when they met, and here was an opportunity to earn her own keep, but also help one of Russia's, rapidly rising writers. And she was very proud of her literature and Dostoevsky, and so it was a kind of job that wasn't just a job; it was an opportunity for deep satisfaction, a deeply meaningful job.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, because the representation that you give of her, and as you say, drawing from her own diaries, is of a woman who was passionate about things, that she very much wanted to do things that were meaningful, not just, meaningful, sure, independence would have been very meaningful to a woman at that time, but she seemed to be someone who really enjoyed having a meaningful project to dig into. Like it needed to matter to her. And stenography hadn't been her original choice, right? She had wanted to go into the sciences. And what's the anecdote? She passed out in one of her biology classes.
Because she saw a cat cadaver.
She saw a cat cadaver. So she wasn't fitted to that, but she seems to have found in Dostoevsky at this time an occupation that she was fitted to. And I don't just mean the stenography stuff. I mean, the actual management of him as a person. Probably would be useful for folks to know, like we often think of these luminary authors as having been famous and rich in their own time. I know when I was reading this, I was also casting back to Herman Melville and the kind of straits that he was in at his death. Hemingway, kind of bounced around financially. The Fitzgeralds, oh my God, they never had any money. And I think people don't really understand that. So at this point, when Anna and Dostoevsky marry, what is the nature of his financial situation and his reputation at that time?
So even among financially strapped writers, Dostoevsky kind of wins the prize of being in a constant state of destitution, almost. I mean, almost literally. He had a gambling addiction, which Anna just began to understand when she realized that some of this character in The Gambler was based on his own experiences. But because of this gambling addiction, and because he was signing, he signed that terrible publishing agreement, and just because of his mismanagement of money, he was constantly in debt. And during his binges in the casinos in Europe, which had actually started even before he met Anna, there were days that he didn't have enough money to pay the hotel bill, and he was almost kicked out of the hotel in Wiesbaden. And so he was sending letters to all of his friends and his family, begging them to send him money. And we know this through the letters that have survived. And so in general, one common theme of Dostoevsky's, I can't think of many letters of Dostoevsky up at this point that don't have some mention of his financial straits. And so that was part of the reality. And imagine what would have happened if he didn't finish The Gambler, right? And that Anna saved that, right?
Right.
He could have been ruined. And in terms of his career was just starting to take off. He'd been in Siberia, in a prison camp for most of the 1850s. And now he'd been back in Russia. He started publishing. He wrote a couple commercially successful novels, and he was right in the middle of working on Crime and Punishment, which was going to be his big success post-Siberia. But he was not yet considered a great writer, right? He was an important writer. And it would be because of Anna that he would eventually write the works that would really establish him as one of Russia's, one of the great voices of world literature. And one of the great gifts that Anna gave him in the 1870s, after they had been married for about 8 years, is that she started a publishing firm of her own, and an imprint. And no woman had done that alone in Russia. She was the first in Russian history. There was one other publishing firm run by 3 of the early feminists, but they had one another to rely on. They had a lot of connections. Anna did this on her own, and her family told her, don't do it. Everyone advised her against it, and she listened, and she listened, and she did it, and she did it anyway.
She did it, and she did it successfully.
And she did it successfully. But what that did for Dostoyevsky is it freed him from the clutches of these really predatory publishers in Russia who gave the author nothing. And he now could start to earn, and they could start to earn much more from his writings than he ever had before Anna had started that company.
I want to take you back just a little bit in the earlier part of your answer there to the bit about Dostoevsky having a gambling addiction, because that, I think, is crucial to not only, how we get the title of this book, which I want you to speak about, but also a kind of a key moment in their relationship that happens when they're in exile, right, for like 4 years, because he's got these debts and he can't come back to Russia, and they have no money. And not only is she supportive of him, I mean, this is before the publishing venture, but she's supportive of his efforts to produce whatever it is he's going to be producing on the page, but she also recognizes something really important in him, and that seems to be that the gambling is almost essential to the creative process. But there's this great incident that I want you to talk about while we still have time.
Is it the one where she finally saves him from gambling, or the one where she herself?
Where she herself goes to the casino.
I'd like to read a passage. Let me just contextualize it. This is from the second part of the book called The Reckoning, which is really the crucible era in the relationship to Dostoevsky, where Anna is discovering the real Dostoevsky. And one of the things she's learning, firsthand, is that he has this terrible gambling addiction. And so they're in Baden-Baden, a chic gambling resort in Western Germany. And he is waking up every morning at the crack of dawn, going to the casino, blowing everything and anything that they have. He's coming back. He's falling on his knees. He's apologizing. He's begging Anna for her forgiveness for poisoning her life. And then he begs her for more money. And he pawns her wedding dress and her wedding ring and her underwear at one point. And they don't have 3 meals a day. I mean, imagine this. She's 20 years old. He's 44. She is living this life with her new husband. She's pregnant. They're living in Dresden. And she snaps, and she can't take it anymore. One day she throws the money at his feet and says, I don't care. You can blow it all. I don't care. And then she writes in her diary, she says, in her secret diary, which he was not supposed to have read, and I don't believe he did, but we do, because I quote amply from it in the novel. She said, if he thinks I'm his slave here to obey his every whim, then it's about time I something like disabuse him of that, of that illusion, or I show him otherwise. And so what does she do? That very day, she goes in secret herself to gamble. And I'll just read to you a brief passage from the scene of Anna Dostoyevskaya gambling. We're at the casino. A thin crowd of elegantly clad women and smartly dressed men hovered nearby, sipping wine and puffing on richly pungent papyrosas. Anna does not specify whether this was the Red Hall, where Dostoevsky spent most of his time, or the secondary room, but either way, she could have had no doubt that she might run into him at any moment. She staked a thaler on the first 12 numbers and won 2. Then she bet on the last 12 and won another 2. That put her up by $4. Then she lost 3 times in a row, only to win back $2, then another 4, then lost 2, then win 5. She was up by 7, now 8, or $110 in today's money. It was a terrific roll, she knew. Just the time for her to quit the table, as she'd so often advised Dostoyevsky to do after a winning streak. And yet, at that moment, my strength of mind seemed to desert me. And I'm quoting from her diary. She was unable to pull herself away. Something seemed to tempt me to stake on the center numbers, which never won. The lady next to her was doing the same, obviously annoyed this is still Anna speaking. The lady next to her was doing the same, obviously annoyed at my making the same bets as she did. I even thought I heard her make a remark about it. But Anna kept on doing it anyway, pressing up against the woman so closely that the flower in her hat became entangled in the lady's veil. Then she stopped paying attention to the lady altogether, began making her own decisions, all her attention concentrated on that green baize table, the spinning carousel, the whirring ivory ball. She began losing one spin after another until, just as inexplicably, she started winning again. Then she lost, then she won again. When she found the presence of mind to count up her coins, she discovered that she was up by $19 or $270. It was money the Dostoyevskys could have used, certainly. Along with the money from her mother, it would have been enough to pay off many of their most pressing debts, not least their back rent. I'd like Fady to come in now so that I could show him, she thought with defiance as she placed another bet. Sure enough, at that very instant, there he was, standing in the doorway. I could have easily crept out without his seeing me, but was horrified at the whiteness of his face. A dead giveaway to her that he'd just suffered another loss. At the sight of him, her defiance gave way to concern, and she rushed up to him without even noticing that she'd lost her latest bet. When Dostoyevsky saw her, he was furious that she would come alone at her age, in her condition, to such a place. He grabbed her hand now to escort her right out of the casino, lecturing her sternly on how she should have quit the table immediately after winning, or she was bound to lose everything she'd won. I've noticed things like that happen to you too, she responded bitterly, her defiance returning. Besides, she added, it wasn't such a tragedy losing a few 5 golden pieces, seeing as I'd just had some money sent from Petersburg. Unlike her husband, she had managed to leave the tables with only $1 less than she'd come with.
It's a terrific example of how she comes to have not just sympathy for him, but empathy for him. And I wrote down a quote that comes up on page 143 about that, where you say, Anna had defied her husband by becoming him. It was at once an act of rebellion and an act of love. And I feel like that really encapsulates so much of the way that their relationship progresses all the way through, actually it's sort of past his death. So really brilliantly done. I think you should talk a little bit, though, since we're talking about the gambling and the gambler, about how the title came to be The Gambler Wife.
So I should just finish up that story. What happened when the Dostoyevskys got home from the casino is he had started teasing Anna, calling her his lost wife, and how lucky she was, telling her how lucky she was that her husband showed up just in the nick of time to save her. And then he started teasing her and calling her my little gambler wife, my gambler wife. And I thought about that line, and that was not the original title of this book. The original title of the book was The Gambler's Wife, because in early drafts, I was fascinated by how and why Anna had the presence of mind to stand by her husband's side during these darkest days of his gambling. But as I dug into the story and spent more time with her and dug into the research about her, what I realized is there are 2 gamblers in this book. There's Dostoyevsky himself, who is an addict, and then there's Anna, whose entire life was defined in one way or another by extraordinary risk-taking in business, in life, in marrying this guy in the first place. And so it became clear to me that this was her story. That the most interesting thing in this story is not just the love and the tumultuous love and how she handled his gambling addictions, but how she gambled herself. And I want to thank Dostoyevsky for that incredibly snide remark that he made towards Anna, because he didn't realize when he said that just how many layers of meaning that phrase, the gambler wife, held for his wife.
Yeah.
He would discover that years later as time went on, and he started to discover the full extent of her gutsiness and her competence. So I'm, I have to thank Dostoevsky, even though he was being really rude in that moment.
Yeah, he certainly was not an even-keeled fellow, but then again, I think the even-keeled fellows don't produce the kinds of works that hold up over time. I'm going to ask you to talk about one more thing, and then I think we'll get Alex back in here to open up for questions that folks watching us may have. So Anna's legacy in Russia is an interesting thing to explore. I found some things where she was referred to as, and you have this in the book, she was called greedy and stingy, tight-fisted and shrewd. And what do you think about those adjectives? I mean, I know from having written a couple of books about women who were denigrated by their critics in their own times, that kind of thing, is not necessarily an accurate representation. Do you think it applied to Anna?
Oh no, not at all. I mean, those kinds of accusations reflect, more about the person making them than about the person they're referring to. And this is one of the unfortunate, truths about Anna's legacy. And she does have a legacy, even though a lot of Russians are not even aware of it, which is a shame. But one of the unfortunate truths is that she got it from both sides. I mean, the feminists thought she wasn't progressive enough because they viewed her as having sold out, having abandoned her dream of emancipation by hitching her fate to this man. But they didn't realize all the complexities of the relationship and what this relationship actually meant to Anna. And then other women thought she was too progressive, like Lydia Chukovskaya, who you just quoted from, who was a 20th century writer. And this is not based on any knowledge of their relationship, but in Russia, being a business person, especially after the Soviet Union was founded, capitalism was outlawed. Being a business person was a bad thing. Being a merchant was, considered, almost like aligning yourself with the devil, with Western greedy materialism. And so naturally, she learned, Lydia Chukovskaya knew a few things about Anna Dostoyevskaya, how tough she was in business. And she immediately concluded, that she was a greedy businesswoman and she was stingy and she didn't even give Dostoevsky enough, money for lunch. I mean, it's insane. But
yeah, it's a completely reductionist assessment of her. And it made me mad, and I can tell it made you mad. And I appreciate that that passion for getting the record straight for this exceptional young woman who she accomplished tremendous things and under tremendous deprivation. And as you said earlier, we might not have any of Dostoevsky's most seminal works without her influence. Perhaps, again, another echo for me with the Fitzgeralds, because I often think that we wouldn't have most of Scott Fitzgerald's best works without his wife's influence.
Therese, can I actually share a few more examples of things that she accomplished? So a lot of it's clear what she did for Dostoevsky. It's clear what she did, for his career. But she did some extraordinary things for Russian literature in general. She was not only the first solo female publisher, she also founded one of the first book distribution businesses in Russia. She founded the first literary museum in Russia. After Dostoyevsky's death, she published 7 editions of the complete collected works of her husband's, which was not only an achievement in itself, but that became the model. How she went about doing that became the model for how all future Russian writers would be published, how their complete collected works would be published. And in fact, word got out, and no less a figure than the wife of Leo Tolstoy came knocking, approached Anna and said, "How did you do this for your husband? I want to do the same for my husband." And a lot of people don't realize that. Anna was also incredibly charitable. I should also say that that enterprise of publishing the complete collected works earned her and her family the equivalent in today's money of $5 million. So she was no shabby businesswoman either. And I think it's that success in business that leads to those kinds of perhaps even envious comments on the part of future artists, who and she was also very charitable. She contributed funds to libraries and schools. She founded one of the first parish schools for Russian peasants in the provinces. And when by the time that school had closed, it had graduated 1,000 peasant girls who otherwise would never have had the opportunity to have that kind of an education, kind of education. And so, and the list goes on. And unfortunately, this is a list that very few people know about. They only know about, her husband. And and that you were right, that part of the goal of this book is to set the historical record straight.
Well, I think folks who are tuned in should absolutely get the book so that they can see this journey for themselves. And now, Alex, if you want to pop back in, I know he's hiding behind the Midtown Scholar sign there. Hello there. Do you have some questions that you can?
Yes, we have a bunch of great questions from the audience. So thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Therese. This is just a wonderful conversation. Once again, got to plug the book, The Gambler Wife, not Gambler's Wife. Gambler Wife is now available for purchase. Head to our website, midtownscholar.com, or simply look in the chat room where I've provided a link. And also to our audience members, if you have a question at any point, please use the Q&A button towards the bottom of your screen. I've got to start with this one from Calvert, who I love this question. They say, can you tell the story of the very funny poem Anna wrote to Dostoyevsky that's quoted in the book?
So during their European travels, when they were, which I described, they were in a constant state of destitution. They couldn't return to Russia. It was a hard time. Well, Anna still had the presence of mind to find the silver lining. And one of the ways that she did that, she and her husband actually composed humorous poetry together, even mocking their circumstances, to kind of inject some humor into what otherwise was a very dark situation. And she wrote a poem on her own to do just that, in which she mocks their poverty, but she also makes fun of her husband's decisions, his business decisions, and his gambling, which was largely responsible for getting him that and putting him in that situation. And I don't have a poem in front of me, but there were lines like, you offered a novel to Katkov, instead you worked on something else, and then you went and blew our money at roulette. Have you no shame, you numbskull?
You numbskull.
Anna calls her husband, Fyodor Dostoevsky, a numbskull. She could get away with it because it was his wife. But it is a wonderful example of not only how she very creatively found the humor even in dark situations, but how she was a talented writer and creative in her own right. In fact, she had published later. She'd never published stories, but she had written stories that were submitted for publication and actually ready to be published. And we don't know why ultimately she didn't submit them, but she was also a talented writer. So yes, that poem, I wish I had that in front of me, but you get the gist. You numbskull, then you blew our money at roulette, you numbskull.
That's great. This next question from Joseph kind of leans into Anna's writing as well. And I think I know the answer to this, but Joseph wants to know, did Anna ghostwrite any of Dostoevsky's work? And I'd add, is there any speculation out there, I'd say?
No, this is not the story of a woman whose whose ideas were stolen by her husband and then never got any credit for them. Anna had helped him copy his works as a stenographer. She advised him creatively, actively, and he started to, and he gave her the opportunity to offer to, he listened to her about some of her creative judgments, something he rarely did to anyone. And so no, we don't know of anything that he, straight out lifted or where she was the ghostwriter. It was a partnership, and they both played their important roles. And later in life, he gave Anna credit for. He told people that, my wife is extremely creative, extremely has real literary ability. And he told her, he said, Anna, you need to write. You need to write. But unfortunately, she was so busy supporting his career and building her publishing business that she didn't have that opportunity.
Adam would like to know, is there any speculation that a character in any of Dostoyevsky's novels or works is based on Anna?
Oh, that's such a big question. And I explore this in various ways in the book. And let me say, so in the scholarship about Dostoevsky, it's often remarked that, it's odd that people believe that Dostoevsky never portrayed Anna, his own wife, who meant so much to him, in his fiction. Rather, he preferred the femme fatale type of, that appears over and over again in his fiction. And that was based on his own secret lover, with whom he had an affair and Anna suspected was perhaps even continuing that affair early in their marriage, based on Polina Suslova. But that's strange to me, because when I experienced the story of what she did for him, and especially in those hard years of European exile, and how she stood by his side and didn't judge him for his gambling addiction and loved him unconditionally, I'm very surprised that scholars don't realize that theme of compassion that is so prominent in Dostoevsky, that theme of offering every human being their dignity, no matter how far they've fallen socially or morally. That's such an important theme in so many of Dostoevsky's characters. He had a living embodiment of that kind of compassion right in front of him. And so that's one of my arguments in this book. We don't have to look to Christian theology to find the source of Dostoevsky's deep interest in this theme of compassion. We can look to his own life, and we can look to the woman who exhibited precisely that kind of compassion towards him, and it regenerated him. He even said that once to Anna, and he even said something else to Anna, which, boy, if my wife ever said this to me, I don't know, I'd probably fall over. He woke her up one night and to kiss her goodnight, and he said, "It's for those like you that Christ came. It's for those like you that Christ came." And Dostoevsky, this was not a metaphor to him. Dostoevsky was not big on metaphors, if you know his writing. He's very literal. But he said that to her, and he believed it. And I think about the women like Sonia Marmeladova in Crime and Punishment, the fallen prostitute who redeems Raskolnikov, the murderer. And I just can't help but thinking of, in so many ways, this is what Anna did for him.
This next question is from Derek. Derek asks, why isn't there more known about Anna if she had such a profound impact on Dostoevsky's life? I should say, why isn't there more work about Anna?
That's a really good question. Why is it more people don't know about Katerina Pavlova, who was one of the greatest poets of the 19th century Russia, and who was forgotten in her own time and only rediscovered a half a century later by the symbolist poets. And even today, people don't know. And I just think it has to do with who's in control of the literary establishment, who runs the literary journals. In Russia at the time, it was entirely a man's business. And I just think there was an assumption that Anna fit the portrait of the traditional Victorian wife. And that is the way she's often described in a lot of biographies about Dostoevsky as a kind of appendage to him. But that's, I think, because people are falling prey to their own gendered stereotypes, including, scholars who write about her in that way, with understanding of what she did. I'm not suggesting they don't recognize that, but people just have not taken an interest or enough of an interest to dig around and understand her. And I think another reason is because a lot of the sources that I relied on for this book were in Russian, and some of them were in the archives, and many of them had never been published in English before, or even, very few Russians even know about it. You really have to dig into a rich array of documents to get a full portrait of Anna. And for whatever reason, nobody, certainly in any English-speaking country before me, had done that. I should say there are 2 books in Russian about Anna, but that's it, and she was from Russia. So, and if it weren't for those 2, if it weren't, her last name were not Dostoyevsky, I wonder if even those 2 books would have been written.
Right.
I should mention here that Rachel mentions that the Numbskull poem is on Andrew's Facebook page, Twitter, and Instagram, if you'd like to go ahead and check that out. We've got another question here. This one is from Joseph again. Joseph asks, did Anna get along with her stepson? Or could you talk about that relationship a little bit more?
No. Her stepson was, in fact, Dostoevsky's stepson from his previous marriage. His name was Pasha. And when Anna, early in their marriage, none of Dostoevsky's relatives, including Pasha, wanted this marriage to happen. And they were doing everything they could to try to scuttle the marriage. And the reason is it boiled down to money, because they had been filching money off of Dostoevsky for years, and Dostoevsky was very naive and gullible and very easily influenced by his relatives. And now here they could see that there was a tough woman who stood between his pocketbook and them, and she was a threat. And so Pasha, just to give you an example, he was the worst. He would steal up all the cream in the house just before a meal, so that there would be no cream, so Dostoevsky couldn't use it, for the meal. And Dostoevsky would fly off the handle, and Pasha knew this is all calculated. He knew this would happen, and Pasha would say, "Well, you see, things like this didn't used to happen before Anna was managing the household." It's just really crass, and this goes on throughout their entire marriage until he died in 1900, and yet Anna never disparaged him in public. I think that says a lot about who she is as a person. This young man who was trying to scuttle their marriage, who had caused them so much grief, who almost did scuttle their marriage, Anna had enough depth and humanity and dignity that she never reproached him in public, even when people were telling her that she should set the record straight. And I'm very moved by that kind of compassion. And as you can see, I got a little emotional about that. I wasn't expecting that to happen. But it just struck me because I know what he did to them and how she responded. And it really is truly remarkable.
Yeah, and in the book, you've got a number of those incidents in which, we might be sort of yelling at her to put him in his place. And yet she takes the high road, which is quite admirable.
And she addresses that in her memoir. She says, also keep in mind, I was young, I was 20 years old. There are reasons that I'd never encountered this before. I never saw this kind of unscrupulous behavior. It wasn't in my family. And so she admitted later on in life, she didn't know how to deal with it. And she admits in her memoir that she was seriously considering divorce, that she didn't know how this marriage would continue under these circumstances. And so she said to Dustin, she basically sold her dowry so that they could raise enough money so they could get out of Petersburg and go to Russia on their honeymoon and save their marriage. And Dostoevsky didn't want her to do it. He said, no, don't do this. You're not supposed to do this. And she unleashed, all of her passion on him. And she said, if we don't do this, if we don't get out of Dodge, we may never stay married. And he heard her. He knew when to shut up and when to listen to his wife. And that was one of those moments.
We have time for just one more question here, and I saved this question for last. It's from Sam. Sam asks, What would you most like readers to take away about Anna's life after reading your book?
Her complexity, that, we often, it's so easy to reduce people to certain stereotypes, whether gendered stereotypes, historical stereotypes. And what I tried so hard to do in this book is to paint a portrait of the complex, fascinating, contradictory human being that she was. Even though she was a young feminist and embodied many of the values of the feminist movement, their ambition, their intelligence, their drive, their desire to make it on their own, she was also very traditional. And she believed in love, and she believed in unconditional love, and she believed in standing by her husband's side. It's that combination of qualities that make her so fascinating and so complex. And so, and I trace that through the book. And so that's what I hope. I hope readers come away really recognizing that and seeing a full-blooded human being in this story that makes them think about their own lives.
Andrew, Therese, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This really was just a wonderful conversation. The book, one more time, is titled The Gambler Wife. It is now available. Get it at your local indie. Get it through us, midtownscholar.com, or look in the chat room. I've provided a link there. We have signed book plates from Andrew as well if you order through us. Thank you again to Andrew and Therese. Thank you to our audience. We had some really wonderful questions this evening. And Andrew, I'd just like to kick it back to you one last time, if you have any last words for our audience.
So thank you for those wonderful questions, some of which I've never gotten before. And so it was really fun to think about them again after having written about them. But I also want to thank Therese for the really thoughtful questions that you asked, and the depth with which you clearly read the book, and I really appreciated that.
Well, you made my job easy, and it was a pleasure to join you tonight.
Thank you, Therese. And I want to thank Alex and Midtown Scholar Bookstore for hosting this. Really honored to be here tonight.
Welcome. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.